At my granddaughter's wedding, someone handed me a name tag that said, "The Absent Old Lady," and the strange part was that no one seemed surprised to see it there except me. I held the small cream-colored card between my fingers for a moment, long enough to read the words twice, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding them. The ballroom at the Lakeshore Grand Hotel in Chicago shimmered with soft golden lights, crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, and a string quartet played something delicate near the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Guests laughed and clinked glasses of champagne, dressed in tailored suits and elegant dresses that probably cost more than my first car. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my granddaughter Emily's life, and I had spent weeks thinking about how proud my late husband would have been to see her walking down that aisle. Yet there I stood at the check-in table, staring at a label that reduced me to a joke. The young woman organizing the name tags smiled politely, clearly unaware of the words printed on the card she had just handed me. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're seated at table 12, she said cheerfully, already reaching for the next envelope. I pinned the tag to the shoulder of my navy blue dress anyway. At 72, you learn that dignity sometimes means staying quiet long enough to understand what's really happening. As I walked into the reception hall, the music drifted softly across the room, and the scent of fresh roses filled the air from enormous centerpieces arranged on every table. My son Daniel stood near the bar speaking with a group of guests, his tuxedo perfectly pressed. For a brief second our eyes met, and I wondered if he had noticed the name tag. If he had, he didn't show it. He simply looked away and took a sip of his drink as if nothing at all was unusual. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. Someone had planned it. I moved slowly through the crowd, smiling politely whenever someone glanced my way. A few people seemed to notice the tag and whisper to each other before quickly looking down at their phones or turning back to their conversations. The words on that card had already done their work. They had turned me into a story. The strange thing was, 3 months earlier, I had helped Emily choose the lace for her wedding veil. I had sat with her in a little bridal shop downtown, holding swatches of fabric while she asked my opinion about every tiny detail, from the length of the train to the shade of ivory that would match the flowers. She hugged me when we left that store and told me I was the strongest woman she knew. Standing in that ballroom now, I wondered what had changed between that afternoon and tonight. Or maybe nothing had changed at all, and I was only just beginning to see the truth clearly. Because when I reached table 12 and looked around at the carefully arranged seating cards, I noticed something else that made my heart sink quietly in my chest. Every seat at the table belonged to someone from my daughter-in-law Linda's side of the family. And suddenly the words on my name tag didn't feel like a joke anymore. They felt like a message. The chair at table 12 felt colder than the rest of the room, though that was probably just my imagination. I set my small clutch purse beside my plate and looked around carefully, pretending to admire the tall arrangement of white roses in the center of the table while I studied the faces seated around me. Linda's relatives filled every seat. Her brother Mark was already halfway through a glass of champagne, laughing loudly with a woman I assumed was his wife. Across from me sat Linda's mother, Patricia, wearing a silver dress that caught the light every time she moved her arm. She glanced briefly at my name tag, and then looked away so quickly it almost made me smile. That reaction told me more than words ever could. They had all seen it already. They knew exactly what it said. The quartet finished their song, and the gentle hum of conversation swelled through the ballroom again. Waiters moved gracefully between the tables carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne flutes. Somewhere near the dance floor, someone cheered as the bride and groom finished taking photographs with the wedding party. From where I sat, I could see Emily across the room near the entrance to the terrace, her white gown catching the warm glow of the chandeliers. She looked radiant, the way brides always do in that brief moment before the reception truly begins. For a moment my chest softened with pride. I remembered the little girl who used to run through my backyard with grass stains on her knees, asking endless questions about the roses her grandfather had planted years before she was born. But then I noticed something else. Emily had not looked in my direction even once since I arrived. Not once. A waiter stopped beside our table and placed a small basket of warm bread near the center. Mark reached for a roll and nodded casually toward my shoulder. "That is quite the name tag," he said with a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Patricia cleared her throat and quickly changed the subject. asking someone about the honeymoon plans, but the damage was already done. I tore off a small piece of bread and set it on my plate, though I was not hungry. Across the ballroom, I could see Daniel again, still near the bar, still avoiding my gaze. It was strange how quiet the truth can be when everyone in the room has silently agreed not to speak it out loud. I watched the way guests moved through the reception, greeting one another, exchanging polite smiles, lifting their glasses in celebration. And yet I could feel it beneath the surface like a current under calm water. A story had been told about me here tonight. A story repeated often enough that it had become a fact in the minds of people who had never even met me before. I wondered how long it had been spreading. Weeks perhaps. Months. Long enough that someone felt comfortable printing those words onto a card and pinning it to my dress without hesitation. My fingers rested lightly on the edge of the tablecloth as I considered the strange path that had brought me here. Because the truth was, if anyone in this room had truly known the past 15 years of my life, they would have realized something very simple. I had never been absent from this family. Not once. In fact, if anything, I had been there far more than anyone realized. The music shifted into something softer as the guests began finding their seats, and the gentle clinking of silverware against china slowly replaced the louder conversations that had filled the ballroom only minutes before. A waiter moved quietly beside our table and poured sparkling water into each glass with the kind of careful attention that expensive hotels train into their staff. I thanked him with a small nod and watched the bubbles rise slowly to the surface of the glass. Across the room, the master of ceremonies adjusted a microphone near the dance floor, preparing for the official welcome speech. Around me, Linda's relatives leaned closer together in comfortable conversation, the kind that comes easily when everyone shares the same version of a story. Patricia spoke quietly to the woman beside her, though her voice carried just enough for me to hear a few words drift across the table. She was never really around, she said softly, as though she was discussing the weather instead of a person sitting 3 feet away. The woman next to her nodded in polite agreement. That is what Linda told us. It must have been hard for Daniel growing up like that. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of water, allowing the cool taste to settle my thoughts. It was remarkable how easily a lie could travel when it was wrapped in sympathy. Somewhere behind me, a group of guests laughed, and the sound echoed lightly beneath the chandeliers. I turned slightly in my chair, pretending to adjust the place setting in front of me while my eyes moved once more across the reception hall. Daniel was finally making his way toward the head table where the wedding party had begun to gather. His shoulders were straight, his expression calm, but there was a stiffness in his posture that I recognized instantly. I had seen it years ago when he was a boy trying to pretend he had not broken the kitchen window with a baseball. Some habits never change, even when a person grows older. The room grew quieter as the bride and groom stepped onto the small platform near the center of the ballroom. Applause rippled through the guests as Emily and her new husband smiled nervously toward the crowd. I felt a brief warmth again when I saw her reach for his hand. Weddings always carry that hopeful promise of a new beginning. But as the applause faded, I noticed Linda standing just behind the couple, one hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder like a proud stage director admiring her finished production. For a moment her eyes swept across the crowd, and when they reached my table they paused. She looked directly at the name tag on my shoulder, then back at my face. Her lips curved into the faintest smile before she turned away again to speak with someone beside her. It was a small expression, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying attention. But I understood it perfectly. That smile said everything the words on my name tag were meant to say. The orchestra began another gentle melody as the master of ceremonies welcomed the guests and thanked everyone for traveling to Chicago to celebrate the marriage. While he spoke, I folded my hands quietly in my lap and allowed the past to drift through my memory. Because the strange part about hearing those whispers tonight was not the cruelty of the lie. The strange part was how easily I could trace the moment when the truth began to disappear. It started 15 years earlier, on a rainy afternoon, the day Linda first walked through the front door of my house and introduced herself as the woman my son planned to marry. The memory arrived so clearly that for a moment the music in the ballroom faded into the background. 15 years earlier, the rain had been falling steadily against the windows of my small house in Evanston, the kind of gray afternoon that makes the whole world feel quiet. Daniel had called that morning, and asked if he could stop by with someone special. His voice carried the nervous excitement of a young man who believed he had found the future. I spent the next hour tidying the kitchen, setting out coffee cups, and placing a small plate of cookies on the table the way my mother used to do whenever guests arrived. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to see my son standing there with a tall blonde woman beside him, her coat damp from the rain and her smile bright enough to fill the doorway. "Mom, this is Linda," Daniel said. "The woman I told you about." She stepped forward and shook my hand warmly, thanking me for inviting them over even though she had never been to my home before. I remember noticing how confident she seemed, the way she looked around the living room as if she was already imagining herself there. We sat together at the kitchen table while the rain tapped softly against the glass, and Linda spoke easily about her work, her plans, and the life she and Daniel hoped to build. At the time, I believed every word she said. I believed it because my son looked at her with the quiet devotion that only appears when a person feels certain they have chosen the right partner. Over the months that followed, Linda became part of every holiday and family dinner. She helped decorate the Christmas tree in my living room, brought homemade pies to Thanksgiving, and insisted on calling me Mom even before the wedding. I told friends that I felt lucky to have such a thoughtful daughter-in-law. When Daniel proposed to her the following spring, it was in the garden behind my house where my late husband had planted rows of roses years earlier. I still remember Linda standing beneath the old maple tree holding out her hand so I could admire the ring. She hugged me that afternoon and said she hoped their future children would grow up playing in the same yard where Daniel had spent his childhood. And when Emily was born a few years later, I drove to the hospital with a small knitted blanket I had made myself, the same soft shade of ivory that matched the one my mother had given Daniel when he was a baby. Linda thanked me politely and allowed me to hold the newborn for only a few minutes before explaining that the nurses recommended limited visitors during the first day. At the time, I accepted that explanation without question. Looking back now, sitting quietly at the reception table surrounded by strangers who believed I had abandoned my own family, I could see how small changes had begun long before tonight. Invitations that arrived later than everyone else's. Phone calls that slowly became less frequent. Holiday gatherings that somehow moved to different houses without anyone mentioning it to me until the last minute. None of those moments seemed important on their own. But as I listened to the orchestra play and watched Linda move confidently through the ballroom greeting guests like the gracious hostess of the evening, I realized something that made the entire room feel suddenly colder. The story about me had not appeared overnight. It had been written slowly, year after year, until tonight it had become the truth everyone believed. The applause for the newly married couple faded slowly, replaced by the comfortable hum of conversation and the quiet clatter of silverware as the first course was served. A waiter placed a small white plate in front of me, carefully arranged with roasted vegetables and a portion of salmon, but I barely noticed the food. My mind was still moving through the years that had brought us to this moment. It had not happened all at once. That was the clever part. After Emily was born, Linda began explaining that new parents needed privacy, that routines were important for a growing child. At first I believed she was simply being protective. Weeks turned into months, and the visits became less frequent. When I offered to babysit, Linda would smile politely and say they had already made other arrangements. When birthdays came around, I would send gifts and receive a brief thank you message a few days later. The tone was always warm, always respectful, and yet something invisible had begun to shift between us. I remember one particular afternoon about 10 years ago when Daniel called to say they were thinking about moving into a larger home closer to downtown Chicago. The neighborhood they liked was beautiful but expensive, far beyond what a young family could usually afford. I had recently sold a small antique shop that my late husband and I had owned for nearly 2 decades, and I still had most of the savings from that sale. Without hesitation, I offered to help with the down payment. Daniel resisted at first, saying he did not want to take advantage of me, but I told him families help one another. That was the way his father and I had always believed life should work. A few weeks later, we stood together in front of the new house, a lovely brick place with tall windows and a small garden in the back. Linda hugged me that day and thanked me for making it possible. She promised that Emily would grow up knowing how much her grandmother loved her. For a while, things seemed to improve. I visited the house several times during the first year, bringing homemade soup during the winter and helping Emily plant flowers along the garden path in the spring. But gradually the invitations slowed again. Linda began explaining that Emily's schedule was very busy with school and activities. Sometimes weeks passed without a single call. When I asked Daniel about it, he sounded distracted and assured me everything was fine, that Linda was simply managing a busy household. Sitting now in the glow of the wedding reception, I realized that those small distances had created something much larger than I understood at the time. Because while I believed I was quietly supporting my family from the background, another story had been taking shape. A story where my help had disappeared and my presence had slowly been rewritten as absence. Across the room, Linda laughed with a group of guests, accepting compliments about the beautiful wedding she had organized. People congratulated her for raising such a wonderful daughter. I watched the way she accepted their praise with effortless grace, and I could not help noticing the irony. The same woman who stood proudly at the center of this celebration had spent years carefully erasing the person who helped make that life possible. And tonight, surrounded by music, champagne, and smiling faces, the final version of that story had been pinned neatly to my shoulder for everyone to read. The first course disappeared from the tables almost unnoticed, replaced by polished plates and the quiet rhythm of servers moving through the ballroom with practiced precision. A warm glow from the chandeliers spread across the room as the orchestra shifted into a softer melody, something light and celebratory meant to accompany laughter and polite conversation. Around me, the guests seemed comfortable, relaxed in the way people are when they believe they understand everyone in the room. A few tables away, someone raised a glass and offered a cheerful toast to the newly married couple, and applause rolled across the hall once more. I folded my hands gently on the tablecloth and allowed my gaze to travel across the reception hall again. Emily and her husband were now seated at the long head table beside the wedding party, smiling politely as relatives approached to congratulate them. Daniel sat near his daughter, speaking with a man in a dark suit who appeared to be one of the groom's uncles. Linda stood nearby, accepting compliments about the flowers, the music, the elegant menu she had chosen for the evening. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But perfection is often just a carefully arranged surface, and I had lived long enough to recognize how easily appearances can hide the truth. A voice beside me broke through my thoughts. "You must be Margaret," the woman seated across from me said politely. She was younger than Patricia, perhaps in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a curious expression. "Linda mentioned you once or twice." I returned a small smile. "That is very thoughtful of her." The woman hesitated, glancing briefly at the card pinned to my dress. "I hope you do not mind my saying this, but I was surprised when she told us you had not been part of the family for many years. It must have been difficult for everyone." Her tone was gentle, sympathetic, the tone people use when discussing a quiet tragedy that cannot be changed. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I listened. It was remarkable how complete the story had become. Not just absence, but abandonment. Not just distance, but indifference. Whoever had built this version of my life had done the work carefully. I took a slow sip of water before answering. "Families can be complicated," I said simply. The woman nodded as if that explained everything. Around us, the servers began delivering the main course, and the scent of roasted chicken and herbs drifted through the room. At the far end of the hall, the master of ceremonies stepped forward again to announce that several family members would soon be offering speeches for the couple. Linda moved quickly toward the stage area, speaking briefly with the event coordinator before returning to her seat with the confident stride of someone who believed the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. As I watched her, a quiet memory surfaced in my mind from 3 months earlier. It had been a bright morning in early spring when I sat across from a lawyer in a small office overlooking Michigan Avenue. At the time, I had not been thinking about weddings or name tags or whispered stories. I had simply wanted to understand the paperwork my late husband had arranged years before his passing. The lawyer had reviewed the documents carefully, then looked up at me with an expression that suggested he had just confirmed something important. I had left that office with a slim folder in my purse and a much clearer understanding of how certain things in my family truly worked. Sitting now beneath the chandeliers of the wedding reception, listening to the cheerful music and watching Linda prepare for the next part of the evening, I realized that the story everyone believed about me was missing one very important detail. And soon enough, that detail would no longer remain quiet. The soft clink of a spoon against a champagne glass echoed across the ballroom, and the conversations around the room slowly faded as guests turned their attention toward the small stage near the dance floor. The master of ceremonies stepped forward with a warm smile and welcomed everyone again, thanking them for traveling from different parts of the country to celebrate the marriage of Emily and her husband. A ripple of applause followed his words, and then he announced that a few family members would offer speeches to honor the couple. Linda rose from her chair almost immediately, smoothing the front of her elegant pale blue dress before walking confidently toward the microphone. She moved with the calm assurance of someone who believed the entire evening belonged to her. The room watched her with interest as she reached the stage and adjusted the microphone slightly. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying easily through the speakers. "As Emily's mother, it means the world to me to see so many friends and relatives gathered here tonight." Guests nodded and smiled as she continued, thanking the families who had helped make the wedding possible. She spoke about Emily's childhood, describing her as a bright and loving daughter who had grown into a remarkable young woman. Several people laughed softly when she shared a story about Emily learning to ride a bicycle in the driveway years ago. From where I sat, I could see Emily smiling politely while listening to the speech, though there was a hint of nervousness in her expression that only someone who knew her well might notice. Linda paused briefly and glanced across the ballroom as if searching for the next part of her story. Her eyes drifted past several tables before settling for a moment in my direction. The faint smile returned to her lips, the same controlled expression she had worn earlier in the evening. "Families are built on love, support, and presence," she continued, choosing her words with careful emphasis. "And sometimes the people who show up consistently are the ones who shape a child's life the most." A few guests murmured their agreement. Patricia nodded proudly from her seat, while Mark lifted his glass slightly as though the comment deserved recognition. Linda went on to thank her parents, her friends, and Daniel for always being there for Emily during every stage of her life. Each name received polite applause from the audience. I noticed that she never once mentioned me. It was a small omission, but in a room filled with carefully chosen words, silence can speak louder than anything else. When Linda finished her speech, the room applauded warmly, and the orchestra played a brief celebratory note before the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "Thank you, Linda," he said cheerfully. "Now we will invite a few more family members to share their thoughts." As the next speaker prepared to walk toward the stage, I rested my hands calmly on the edge of the table and allowed myself a quiet breath. Across the room, Linda stepped down from the platform, satisfied with the performance she had just delivered. Guests around me began whispering again, praising the heartfelt speech they had just heard. I could feel the story about my absence growing stronger with every word that had been spoken tonight. But as I watched the stage lights reflect gently against the polished floor, I also remembered the slim folder resting in my purse. And for the first time that evening, I realized that the next speech might not unfold the way Linda expected. The next speaker finished his short toast with a cheerful story about the bride's college years, and the room responded with warm laughter and polite applause. Glasses clinked again as the master of ceremonies thanked him and glanced down at the small list in his hand. "We have time for one more short message from family before dinner continues," he said with an easy smile. Around the ballroom, people settled back into their chairs, expecting another familiar voice from the groom's side of the family. I sat very still for a moment, listening to the quiet murmur of anticipation ripple through the room. Then I reached calmly into my purse and felt the smooth edge of the slim folder resting inside. The paper had been folded neatly that morning before I left my house, though I had not been certain I would ever need to open it tonight. Sometimes the truth only reveals its moment, when the room is ready to hear it. I rose from my chair slowly. The woman across from me looked surprised as I stepped away from the table, and Mark paused in the middle of lifting his glass. I walked across the ballroom floor with the steady pace of someone who has nothing to hide and nowhere else to be. The chandeliers cast soft reflections along the polished floor as I approached the stage. The master of ceremonies noticed me just as I reached the steps. "Would you like to say a few words as well?" he asked politely, clearly assuming I was another relative of the bride. I nodded once. He handed me the microphone without hesitation and stepped aside. The room quieted almost instantly. From the stage, I could see the entire reception hall laid out beneath the warm lights. Rows of round tables filled with guests who had spent the evening listening to speeches about family, loyalty, and love. Emily looked toward me with a puzzled expression, while Daniel sat frozen in his chair beside her. Linda's face had changed completely. The calm confidence she had carried all evening faded into something more uncertain as she watched me standing there. I adjusted the microphone gently and allowed a small breath before speaking. "Good evening," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am Emily's grandmother." A few guests turned toward one another, whispering softly as they realized who I was. I continued in the same calm tone. "Tonight, I have heard many beautiful stories about family. I have also learned that some people here believe I have not been part of this family for many years." A faint ripple of murmurs passed through the tables. I rested one hand lightly on the folder I had brought with me. Stories have a way of growing when they are repeated often enough. But sometimes the truth is written down very clearly, long before the story begins. Slowly I opened the folder and looked out across the ballroom again. The chandeliers reflected in the wide eyes of the guests who had been whispering only minutes earlier. 3 months ago, I visited a lawyer to review documents my late husband arranged many years ago. Documents connected to the home where my son's family lives, the property where Emily grew up, and several other things that have quietly supported this family for a very long time. The room had grown completely silent now. I could feel every eye in the ballroom fixed on the stage. "I do not usually speak about private matters in public," I said gently. But tonight I realized that when a story about absence becomes popular enough, it can hide the people who were present all along. I closed the folder softly and looked toward the head table where Linda and Daniel Saturday, and I believe the bride deserves to know the full truth about the family she comes from. The silence in the ballroom felt almost tangible after my words settled into the air. For several seconds no one moved, as if the music, the laughter, and the easy confidence of the evening had all been gently paused by something no one expected to hear. I stood calmly beside the microphone, the folder resting lightly in my hands, and allowed the quiet to do its work. Across the room, Emily slowly rose from her chair at the head table, her expression no longer confused but deeply attentive, the way someone looks when they sense that an important truth is about to surface. Daniel remained seated beside her, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on the stage. Linda had gone very still. From where I stood, I could see the careful control returning to her expression, but the calm certainty she carried earlier had disappeared. I opened the folder once more and removed a single sheet of paper. The document itself was not dramatic. It was simply a clear legal statement signed many years ago by my late husband and verified by our attorney. When my husband passed away, I continued gently. He arranged something very simple for our family. He believed that stability mattered more than pride. So he placed several properties and accounts into a trust designed to support his children and grandchildren for many years to come. I held the page where the stage lights could reflect across the printed text. That trust includes the house where my son's family lives today, the property where Emily spent her childhood, and the financial support that helped make opportunities like this beautiful wedding possible. A ripple of whispers spread quietly across the tables as guests exchanged uncertain glances. I lowered the paper and looked directly toward the head table. Again, the person responsible for overseeing that trust was not Daniel, and it was not Linda. I paused for a moment, allowing the room to follow the simple logic of what I was saying. My husband asked me to manage it. The effect of those words moved through the ballroom like a soft wind across still water. Some guests leaned forward in their chairs while others looked toward Linda with open curiosity. Emily's gaze remained fixed on me, her expression slowly shifting from confusion to realization. "For many years I chose to remain quiet about this responsibility," I said calmly. "Families work best when people support one another without needing recognition. But tonight I heard a story repeated many times about my absence, and I realized something important. When a person quietly supports others for long enough, their presence can be forgotten by those who benefit the most." I closed the folder gently and rested both hands on the microphone stand. "Emily, my dear, I want you to understand something as you begin this new chapter of your life. Your home, your education, and even part of this celebration were made possible by a promise your grandfather believed in deeply. A promise that families should always stand behind one another. I looked across the room once more at the guests who had been whispering earlier in the evening. The name tag still rested against my shoulder, but its meaning had already begun to fade. And the truth is very simple. I finished quietly. I was never absent from this family. I was simply working in the background the entire time.